Not since the days of Rudolph Valentino has American womanhood made such unabashed love to an entertainer. But the Sinatra voice has little effect on incredulous newspapermen. He likes, and is like, the youngsters who idolize him. And he is smart enough to know that if he is lucky, they will be his adult public 10 years from now. Will buy the cereals, cigarettes, radios, and cars which he hopes to sell.
And I'm longing to share them all with you.
A decade and a half later, Elvis Presley was treated just as irreverently when he was drafted into the Army.
When well-fed crooner Elvis Presley ambled into Fort Chaffee for 3 days of induction processing, some 50 newsmen were on hand to record every detail. Reporters gathered brief quotes at every step from reveille to taps. Sample: I had a good night's sleep, and then I decided to get up.
During World War II, when for many soldiers a good night's sleep was a definite rarity, a so-called pony edition of Time was sent to U.S. servicemen overseas, printed without advertisements. And by the thousands, the men complained that by not seeing the ads, they were being deprived of an important taste of home. The GIs had a good point, because the thousands of ads that have appeared in Time over the years seem to tell the story of the various decades almost as well as the magazine's editorial content. The 20s were upbeat, the 20s roared, and the ads that filled Time's pages during these years readily reflected the mood of America. You could motor out to the theater in your thoroughly reconditioned Rolls-Royce CS56 PE for only $8,500. You could meet the gang back home for a look at that amazing new development, Kodak Home Movies, and double your success capacity by eating more shredded wheat. Of course, you could also have a brain feast by enrolling at the Brinkler School of Eating. And if all this was just too much, you could always set out for California and get there from New York in a swift 63 hours. With the coming of the 1930s, the good times turned to hard times. And once again, it was reflected in the advertisements in the pages of Time. Of course, hard times didn't mean the end of progress, and the parade of American marvels continued. You could ride in your new $840 Studebaker that featured 12 uncanny mechanical brains that enabled you to do such things as start your engine with the simple single turn of a key and never again have to fuss with a choke in any weather. Or if you had the money, you could get away from it all in your new Pitcairn Autogyro, which enables the owner to fly directly to the scene of almost any sporting event. And when you got there, you could always soothe your nerves with a refreshing Listerine cigarette. It all made you long for the good old days when the Davy Company could tell us with a straight face that its tree surgery business had branch offices. But the good old days were gone forever. Less than 2 years after the 1940s began, the U.S. was at war, and the advertisers in Time quickly jumped aboard the patriotic bandwagon.
We will always remember how they died for liberty. Let's remember Pearl Harbor.
Another favorite theme of Time's advertisers in those war years was to present an often fanciful view of the things we'd have when the fighting was over. And most amazing of all, we were promised television sets that would allow us to pull in pictures from the air just as easily as you tune in your present radio. And when the war did end, the advertisers were right. We could get a 7-inch table model with a circular screen or a big 12.5-inch screen. Would wonders never cease? Well, not in the 1950s, they wouldn't. Shortly after the decade began, Times advertisers announced that for the first time we could fly from coast to coast non-stop. And before long, we could do it in planes that didn't even have propellers. And we could wear suits and dresses made of miracle fabrics with names like Celanese and Dacron, and make black and white snapshots in just 60 seconds. But suddenly came the 60s. And suddenly, advertisers who traditionally avoided conflict were boldly urging customers to speak out. And with the coming of the space age, they were also urging us to reach out. And even on Earth, we were being told of a new plane called a supersonic jet that would let us fly at twice the speed of sound, and of a new and exclusive class of traveler known as the jet set. And we were told of machines as big as a room, called computers, that could solve almost any problem, and of a wonder of the financial world called a credit card. By the 1970s, it seemed that some of our wonders, especially our natural wonders, were beginning to run short. The call for conservation rang loud and clear in the advertising pages of Time. Wonders were still to be had. We could figure our bills on a tiny hand calculator that costs only $179. And we could cook a meal in a minute using something called microwaves. But protest was still in the air in the 1970s. And in the midst of it all, we even found the time to pause for a celebration of America's 200th birthday. But we couldn't stop for long. The 1980s were now upon us, and we worried about the inflation of our dollars and of our bodies. And we were deeply concerned about invaders from outer space taking over our living rooms from the screens of video games. But not to worry. We could now figure out all the answers on one of those computers, which once filled a room, but could now fit on a desktop. While ads like these over the years told us much about ourselves as a nation, they really didn't say much about America's place in the world around us. But the magazine itself had plenty to say. One of its strongest departments dealt with world affairs, a department Time first called Foreign News, and later simply changed to World. In the early 1920s, the magazine viewed with increasing seriousness the death of Lenin and the rise to power of Stalin. But it treated an early upstart named Adolf Hitler with something close to amused indulgence. When Time was only a month old, in April of 1923, it ran a small item about Hitler entitled Audacious Adolf. And even earlier, it looked with some bemusement on a Hitlerian plan to deal with the German Jews.
The fascists adopted a resolution demanding the internment of all Jews in Germany. The idea seems to be that the Jews are asked to report for internment, and failing such action on their part, they are to be hunted down and shot.
It would be 10 years before Hitler actually would come to power and turn that little plan of his into a terrible reality. And by then, Time was taking Audacious Adolf and his henchmen at least a bit more seriously. By the end of 1931, a scowling, shouting Hitler was featured on Time's cover as he neared his goal of taking over Germany. 15 months later, Hitler's wait would end. And as he took power, Time seemed to capture the feelings of most Americans.
Last week, all Germany was flung prostrate before Conqueror Hitler's triumphal car. In what sign does the pudgy little vegetarian with the Charlie Chaplin mustache conquer? Up to last week, he had set forth nothing which could be called a program of what his government intends to do for and with Germany.
Too soon, however, the whole world would know. In 1938, Hitler took over Czechoslovakia and then forced Britain and France to meet with him in Munich to make it all look legal. When he returned from the meeting, British Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain promised the world that Hitler was now satisfied.